The dust swirled across the windswept plains as Delilah Evans clutched her fading hope like the last ember of a dying fire. The day her husband walked out the door and never returned had marked the beginning of a desperate struggle, leaving her alone with 3 hungry children on a failing homestead at the edge of the Montana Territory. The year was 1875, and surviving alone as a woman with 3 young ones wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Delilah pressed a cool cloth to little Mary's forehead as the 5-year-old's fever raged for the 3rd day. 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Sarah huddled nearby, their faces drawn with hunger and worry beyond their years. "Mama, when's Pa coming back?" Thomas asked, his small voice cracking with the weight of a question he'd asked 100 times before. "I don't know, sweetheart," Delilah answered truthfully, her throat tight. It had been nearly 2 months since Frank Evans had packed his belongings, claiming he was heading to town for supplies. The letter that arrived a week later, delivered by a sympathetic shopkeeper, had told the real story. He'd found the gold fields of California more appealing than the hardscrabble life of raising a family. The roof leaked. The garden was failing in the summer drought. The last of their money had gone to medicine for Mary. And tomorrow, if the banker's threats held true, they'd begin the process of taking her land. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Delilah glanced down at her worn dress, smoothed her hair, and moved cautiously to answer. Standing on her porch was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. His trail-worn clothes and the dust covering his boots told of long travel, while the gun holstered at his hip spoke of the dangers that travel entailed. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with hints of silver at the temples. "Name's Quentin Drake. I'm looking for Frank Evans." Delilah's heart sank. Another debt collector, no doubt. "He's gone," she said simply, beginning to close the door. The man's boot stopped it. Not forcefully, but firmly. "I don't mean to intrude, madam, but Frank owes me. We had an arrangement." Behind her, Mary coughed weakly. Delilah felt her resolve hardening, frustration rising in her chest. "Well, sir, he owes a lot of people. He owes his children a father. He owes me a husband. He owes this farm work. Get in line." Something in the man's expression changed as he glanced past her to the children inside. His eyes lingered on Mary's feverish form, then took in the sparse furnishings and empty pantry visible through the open door. "How long's the little one been sick?" he asked, his voice softer. 3 days. The doctor in town says it's just a summer fever, but..." She trailed off, unwilling to share her fears with this stranger. Quentin Drake's gaze traveled over the failing farm, the unplowed fields, the broken fence, the empty corral. "You trying to run this place alone?" Delilah straightened her spine. "I'm managing." One of his eyebrows arched skeptically. "With 3 kids and 1 sick." He shook his head. "That's not managing, madam. That's drowning slowly." "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Mr. Drake." To her surprise, he chuckled, a deep sound that seemed to rumble up from his chest. "No, you surely didn't." His expression grew more serious. "Look, I came for what Frank owes me, but I can see there's nothing here to collect. Seems to me he left you with the bigger debt." Inside, Thomas had moved to stand protectively near his mother, small fists clenched. "You leaving too, mister?" Quentin considered the boy, then looked back at Delilah. His expression changed, something resolving behind those storm blue eyes. He glanced again at the failing farm, the sick child, the determined but exhausted woman before him. "Tell you what," he said finally, "I know horses, crops, and how to fix most anything that breaks. You need help, I need work." He gestured toward the children. She was left behind with 3 kids. He paused, a half-smile forming on his lips. "Then you'll have 4 hands now." Delilah stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need. "Why would you help strangers?" "I've been riding alone too long," he answered simply. "And I've seen what happens to families like yours without help." He extended his hand. "I'll work for meals and a corner to sleep in. When your farm's running again and you don't need me, I'll move on." Delilah looked at his outstretched hand, then at her children, Thomas standing brave but scared, Sarah hiding behind her brother, and Mary burning with fever on the cot. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She took his hand. "There's a barn, you'll sleep there." "Yes, madam," he agreed. "I'll start with that fever. My mother taught me about willow bark tea does wonders." And that was how Quentin Drake became part of their lives, starting with 4 words that would change everything. Then you'll have 4 hands now. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Delilah woke to unusual silence. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the absence of Mary's coughing. Fear stabbed through her as she scrambled from her bed and rushed to her daughter's side, only to find the child sleeping peacefully, her forehead cool to the touch. Relief flooded through her as she stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Quentin was already at work, methodically repairing the fence that had been broken for months. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, grazed nearby, and she noticed he'd already started clearing the overgrown field. He looked up at her approach, pushing back his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Evans. Your daughter's fever broke around midnight. I sat with her a spell to make sure." "You stayed with her all night?" Delilah asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Most of it," he replied with a shrug. "Sleep's never been my particular talent anyway," he gestured toward the house. "I started some coffee on your stove. Hope that's all right." Delilah nodded, momentarily speechless at the simple kindness. It had been so long since anyone had thought to do something for her. "Mr. Drake, Quentin," he corrected. "Or Quen. Mr. Drake was my father, and he wasn't someone I'm keen on being compared to." "Quentin," she amended. "I appreciate what you've done, but I need to be clear. This arrangement is temporary, and I need to know what Frank owed you." Something flashed in his eyes, caution, perhaps, or an old pain. "That's between me and Frank. And yes, madam, temporary is all I'm offering, just until you're back on your feet." She watched him work for a moment longer before returning inside to find all 3 children awake. Mary was sitting up, her cheeks showing color that had been absent for days. "The nice man gave me tea that tasted awful but made my tummy stop hurting," Mary informed her mother seriously. "And he told me a story about a princess who saved herself from a dragon. Did he now?" Delilah asked, surprised again. Thomas looked less convinced. "He has a real gun, Ma, I saw it, and a knife in his boot." "Most men who travel do, Thomas," she replied, though she filed the information away. Who exactly was Quentin Drake? A drifter, a bounty hunter, someone more dangerous? She'd been foolish to let him stay without knowing more, but desperation had clouded her judgment. Over the next few days, however, Quentin proved himself useful beyond measure. He mended fences, repaired the leaking roof, and coaxed the neglected vegetable garden back to life. His knowledge of farming surprised her. He worked with the confidence of someone who'd grown up on the land. One evening, as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep, Delilah finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "Where did you learn all this? Farming, I mean." Quentin was quiet for a long moment, whittling a small wooden horse for Thomas. "Grew up on a spread in Texas, my father's land." His knife continued its precise movements. "Wasn't a kind man, my father, but he taught me to work. And your mother, the one who taught you about medicinal teas." A small smile softened his weathered features. "Cherokee woman, smartest person I ever knew. She understood things, plants, animals, people. Is she?" "Long gone," he said simply. "Both of them are." They sat in companionable silence for a while before he spoke again. "Tomorrow I'll ride into town, see about getting some supplies, maybe speak to this banker who's giving you trouble." "I can't pay for supplies," Delilah said firmly. "I've got money," he replied. When she started to protest, he held up a hand. "Consider it an investment in the farm. You can pay me back when the crops come in." "And the banker?" Quentin's expression hardened slightly. "Some men only respect other men. Sad truth of our world, but there it is. Might help if he knows you've got someone working this land now." The following day, Quentin rode into the small town of Pine Creek. Delilah watched him go with mixed emotions. Part of her feared he wouldn't return, that the responsibility of her failing farm and 3 children would prove too much. Another part worried what would happen if he did come back. She was growing accustomed to his quiet presence, his competent hands, his gentle way with the children. Thomas had taken to following him everywhere, absorbing every bit of knowledge Quentin was willing to share. Sarah, normally shy with strangers, had begun to seek him out to show him her treasures: a pretty stone, a feather, a flower she'd picked. And Mary looked at him like he'd hung the moon after he'd nursed her through her fever. It was dangerous, Delilah knew, to let them grow attached. To let herself grow attached. When the sound of hoofbeats announced his return that afternoon, she was ashamed at the relief that flooded through her. Not only had he returned, but his horse was laden with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, seeds for planting, tools, and even a small bag of candy for the children. "Mr. Hargrove at the general store sends his regards," Quentin said as he unloaded his purchases. "Says he's extending credit based on the promise of your fall harvest." Delilah's eyes widened. "Hargrove hasn't given me credit since Frank left." "Well, he's giving it now." Something in Quentin's tone suggested there was more to the story than he was telling. "And the banker, Mr. Webster." A slight smile tugged at Quentin's lips. "Mr. Webster has agreed to a 90-day extension on your note, provided, of course, that visible improvements continue to be made to the property." "How did you manage that?" Delilah asked, astonished. Webster had been adamant about foreclosing. Quentin shrugged. "Just had a friendly conversation, man to man." She didn't quite believe him, but decided not to press. Whatever he'd done, it had bought them time, and time was what they desperately needed. As the weeks passed, the small farm began to transform under Quentin's tireless work. The fences were mended, the barn repaired, and the vegetable garden flourished. He'd even managed to acquire 2 milk cows and a small flock of chickens through trades with neighboring farmers. More surprising than the physical changes to the farm, however, were the changes in Delilah herself. She found herself laughing again at Mary's antics, at Sarah's earnest stories, at Thomas's attempts to be the man of the house. And sometimes, when Quentin said something particularly dry or clever, she laughed simply because it felt good. She also found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way the sun burnished his skin to a deeper bronze. The gentleness of his large hands when he showed Thomas how to whittle or lifted Sarah onto his shoulders. The quiet competence with which he approached every task. One evening, as summer began its slow transition to fall, they sat together on the porch after a long day of work. The air was sweet with the scent of ripening apples from the small orchard Quentin had pruned back to health. "Harvest will be good this year," he remarked, his gaze on the fields where corn and wheat grew tall. "Should be enough to pay off Webster and get you through the winter with some to spare." Delilah noted his choice of words. "You mean get us through the winter?" Quentin's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Mrs. Evans, Delilah," she interrupted. "If I'm to call you Quentin, you should call me Delilah." A small smile touched his lips. "Delilah, then. Our arrangement was temporary, remember, until the farm was running again." "And it is," she acknowledged, a strange tightness in her chest. "Because of you." "Because of us," he corrected. 4 hands, remember? They were silent for a moment, the weight of unspoken words between them. "The children will miss you," she said finally, unable to admit she would miss him too. "They're strong like their mother," Quentin replied. "They'll be fine." Before Delilah could respond, the sound of approaching riders caught their attention. Quentin was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Get inside," he said, his voice suddenly hard. "Take the children to the back room." "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by his reaction. "Just do as I say, Delilah, please." Something in his tone brooked no argument. She hurried inside, gathering the children and ushering them to the small back bedroom. As the sound of horses drew nearer through the window, she watched as 3 riders approached the farm. Even from a distance, she could tell they weren't locals. They rode with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, their horses expensive, their clothes finer than most in Pine Creek could afford. Quentin stood on the porch, seemingly relaxed, but Delilah had come to know him well enough to recognize the tension in his shoulders, the alertness in his stance. The lead rider, a tall man with a shock of white blonde hair, reined his horse to a stop. "Well, well, if it isn't Quentin Drake." "Long way from Texas, aren't you, Caldwell?" Quentin acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings you to Montana?" "Funny you should ask," the man called Caldwell replied. "Seems a mutual acquaintance of ours has gone missing. Frank Evans, ring any bells?" Delilah's blood ran cold. "These men were looking for Frank, and they knew Quentin." "Can't say it does," Quentin replied evenly. Caldwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's not what our sources say. Word is you've been asking about him all through Colorado and Wyoming." His eyes narrowed. "And now here you are, playing house on his farm." "I'm helping his family," Quentin said. "Nothing more." "His family," Caldwell repeated, glancing toward the house. Yes, I'm sure that's all it is, your well-known charitable nature. One of the other riders leaned forward. Boss, that's definitely the place. The description matches. Caldwell nodded. Well then, Mr. Drake, I believe we'll be staying a while. Frank Evans owes my employer a considerable sum, and I'm here to collect one way or another. Your employer's business is with Frank, not his family, Quentin said, his voice hardening. And Frank's not here. Then his family will have to settle his debts. Caldwell's gaze shifted to the house again, and a cold smile spread across his face, starting with that pretty wife of his. Quentin's hand moved to his gun. I think it's time for you to leave. The atmosphere changed instantly, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Caldwell and his men stiffened, hands hovering near their weapons. 3 against 1, Drake, Caldwell said softly. Those aren't odds I'd bet on. Maybe not, came a new voice, but how about 4 against 3? All heads turned to see Sheriff Jameson and his deputy riding up, rifles resting casually across their saddles. Afternoon, gentlemen, the sheriff said, his voice pleasant but his eyes hard as he surveyed the strangers. Passing through or staying a spell? Caldwell's expression soured. Just passing through, Sheriff. Had some business with Mr. Drake here, but I believe we're finished. Good to hear, the sheriff replied. Pine Creek's a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way. With a last venomous look at Quentin, Caldwell and his men turned their horses and rode off, the sheriff and deputy following at a discreet distance to ensure they left the area. Delilah waited until they were out of sight before rushing outside, the children close behind her. Quentin, what was that about? Who were those men, and how do they know Frank? The questions tumbled out as fear and confusion overwhelmed her. Quentin's expression was grim. We need to talk, Delilah, but not in front of the children. That evening, after the children were asleep, Quentin led Delilah to the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, but neither of them was in a mood to appreciate the beauty. Frank's in trouble, isn't he? Delilah asked quietly. Real trouble, Quentin nodded, his face solemn in the lamplight. Frank got mixed up with some dangerous men back in Texas, gamblers, con men, worse. He borrowed money he couldn't repay. And those men today, they work for his creditors. Yes, Caldwell is a debt collector of sorts, though that's putting it mildly. He enjoys his work too much. Quentin's jaw tightened. They won't stop looking until they find Frank or, he hesitated, or until they get their money some other way, Delilah finished for him, through me. I'm sorry, Delilah, I didn't expect them to track him here. I thought I'd covered my trail better. A new suspicion formed in her mind. Is that why you're here? Are you tracking Frank too? Quentin was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Delilah felt her heart sink. Of course. It all made sense now, his unexpected arrival, his eagerness to help, his questions about Frank. He wasn't simply a good Samaritan, he was hunting her husband. Yes, he finally admitted. I was looking for Frank, but not for the reasons you think. Then explain it to me, she demanded, anger rising to replace her fear. Tell me why you've been lying to me all this time. Quentin ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his inner turmoil. Frank and I served together in the war. We weren't friends exactly, but we had an understanding. After we both drifted for a while, I ended up working as a scout for the army, then as a marshal in Texas. You're a lawman, Delilah asked, surprised. Was he corrected? I quit after. He shook his head. That's not important now. What matters is that about a year ago, Frank showed up in the town where I was living. He was in bad shape, gambling debts, drinking too much. Said he had a family back in Montana but couldn't face you until he'd made something of himself. Anger flared in Delilah's chest. He told you about us while he was gambling away what little money we had. He wasn't proud of it, Quentin said quietly. And he did try to change. Got a job at the livery stable, started saving money. But then he fell in with Caldwell's boss, a man named James Blackwell. Blackwell owns half the gambling dens in Texas and has a finger in every illegal enterprise from there to California. What happened? Quentin's expression darkened. Frank lost everything to Blackwell in a single night of cards, then borrowed more, convinced he could win it back. When he couldn't pay, Blackwell gave him a choice: work off the debt or suffer the consequences. What kind of work? Delilah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The kind decent men don't do, Quentin replied grimly. Frank refused at first. Said he had a family to get back to. That's when things got ugly. Blackwell doesn't take no for an answer. A chill ran through Delilah despite the warm evening. Did they hurt him? Quentin hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. Frank got away before they could. But he knew they wouldn't stop looking. He came to me, asked for help. I agreed to hide him, get him out of Texas. In return, he promised to go straight back to his family, to you, and make things right. But he didn't, Delilah said softly. He came here, took what little money we had left, and disappeared again. I'm sorry, Delilah. I thought he'd keep his word. When I realized he hadn't, I started tracking him. I wanted to bring him back to you, make him face his responsibilities. Quentin's eyes met hers, filled with regret. I never expected to find you in such dire straits, or to— He trailed off, or to what? She pressed. Or to care what happened to you and the children, he admitted quietly. That wasn't part of the plan. The simple honesty of his statement caught her off guard. For weeks, she'd been fighting her growing feelings for this man, telling herself it was just gratitude, just the relief of having help. But now, facing the possibility that he might leave, that he had always intended to leave, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. And now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What's your plan now? Quentin looked out at the dark fields, the farm they'd worked together to save. Now I think we need to consider that Frank might not be coming back, and that Blackwell's men won't stop looking for him or for what he owes. The farm, Delilah said, understanding dawning. They'll try to take the farm. Yes, unless what? Quentin turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. Unless we find Frank first and end this. Or unless we can raise enough money to pay off his debt and make Blackwell back off. How much does he owe? Quentin named a sum that made her gasp. It was more money than the farm would produce in 3 good years. Then finding Frank is our only option, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Our? Quentin's eyebrow raised slightly. Yes, our, Delilah insisted. This is my family's safety at stake. I'm not sitting idly by while you handle it alone. A small smile tugged at his lips. Stubborn woman. Practical woman, she corrected. 4 hands, remember, their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond words. In that moment, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The following morning, Sheriff Jameson arrived with news. Caldwell and his men had left town, but not before making inquiries about Frank Evans at every establishment in Pine Creek. They're offering a reward for information, the sheriff explained, accepting the cup of coffee Delilah offered. Claiming it's for a debt owed, but I don't like the look of them. Don't trust men who smile with their mouths but not their eyes. You're right not to trust them, Quentin said grimly. They work for a man named James Blackwell. He's wanted in 3 states, but no one can ever pin anything on him directly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. And how do you know so much about it, Drake? Quentin hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. Former U.S. Marshal, I retired, but old habits die hard. Jameson examined the badge, then handed it back with new respect in his eyes. That explains a few things, like why you were so interested in Webster's banking practices when you first came to town. Delilah looked at Quentin in surprise. What about Webster? The sheriff answered before Quentin could. Your friend here had quite a talk with our banker. Seems Webster's been foreclosing on farms and then selling the land for a fraction of its worth to a company out of Denver. Same company bought up half the water rights in the county last year. And let me guess, Delilah said, the pieces falling into place, this company has connections to Blackwell. It's one of his fronts, Quentin confirmed. Blackwell's moving beyond gambling. He's buying up land, water rights, mining claims, building an empire. And my farm. Strategic location, Quentin explained. Controls access to the creek that feeds half the county. Webster was supposed to foreclose on you, then sell to Blackwell's company. When I showed up and started making improvements, it complicated things. Delilah felt as though the ground were shifting beneath her feet. All this time, she'd thought Frank had simply abandoned them out of weakness or selfishness. But this suggested something darker, that he might have been part of a larger scheme. Do you think Frank knew? She asked quietly. About Blackwell wanting our land, Quentin's expression softened. I don't know, Delilah. Frank made a lot of bad decisions, but I don't want to believe he deliberately put his family in danger. Sheriff Jameson cleared his throat. I hate to add to your troubles, but there's something else. A body was found near Piney Ridge last week. Male, about your husband's age. The remains were, well, they weren't in good condition, been there a while from the look of things. Delilah felt the blood drain from her face. You think it might be Frank? Can't say for certain. There wasn't much to identify, but he had this in his pocket. The sheriff reached into his vest and pulled out a tarnished pocket watch. Notice the initials on the back. Delilah's hand trembled as she took the watch. F.E. Frank Evans. It was the watch she'd given him on their wedding day, the one family heirloom she'd brought to the marriage. It's his, she whispered, closing her fingers around the cold metal. Despite everything, his abandonment, his lies, his failings, a wave of grief washed over her. Whatever Frank had done, he had been her husband, the father of her children. And now, it seemed, he was gone forever. Quentin moved to her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Delilah, she nodded mutely, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. I'll need someone to come make a formal identification, the sheriff said awkwardly. I understand if you'd rather not, Mrs. Evans, perhaps Mr. Drake. I'll go, Quentin agreed. Delilah should stay with the children. Thank you, she managed, grateful for his understanding. The idea of seeing Frank's body, or what remained of it, was more than she could bear. After the sheriff left, promising to return the following day to take Quentin to the morgue, Delilah sat at the kitchen table, the watch clutched in her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Quentin moved about quietly, making tea, giving her space to grieve. When he finally placed a steaming cup before her, she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. What do I tell the children? She asked brokenly. Quentin sat across from her, his face somber. The truth, as gently as you can. That their father had problems, made mistakes, but loved them in his way, that he won't be coming home. And about the men looking for him, about the danger we're in, one thing at a time, he advised. Let them grieve first. Children are resilient, but they need time to understand. Delilah nodded, drawing strength from his calm presence. If it is Frank, if he's really gone, what happens to Blackwell's claim against him, against us? In a just world, it would die with him, Quentin said, but Blackwell isn't known for justice. He might still try to collect from you, or more likely, he'll continue with the plan to acquire your land through Webster. So we're still in danger. Yes, he admitted, but you're not alone, Delilah, I promise you that. The weight of his promise hung in the air between them, solid and reassuring. Despite the grief, despite the danger, Delilah felt a small flame of hope kindling in her chest. With Quentin beside her, perhaps they could find a way through this darkness. The following day, Quentin rode into town with Sheriff Jameson. Delilah spent the morning with her children, finding the right words to explain that their father was never coming home. Thomas's face had hardened, Sarah had cried, and little Mary, too young to fully understand, had simply asked if that meant Mr. Quentin would be their papa now. The innocent question had left Delilah speechless, a blush rising to her cheeks. No, sweetheart, she'd finally managed. Mr. Quentin is our friend, he's helping us, that's all. But as the day wore on, she found herself wondering what would happen when this crisis passed. Would Quentin leave, as he'd always said he would? The thought brought an unexpected ache to her heart. It was late afternoon when he returned, his expression grim as he dismounted from his horse. Was it him? Delilah asked, meeting him in the yard, away from the children's ears. Quentin nodded, removing his hat. It was Frank, I'm sorry, Delilah. Although she'd been preparing herself for the news, the confirmation still hit her like a physical blow. Frank was gone. For all his faults, for all the pain he'd caused, he hadn't deserved to die alone on some remote hillside. How did he? She couldn't finish the question. Shot, Quentin said simply. Likely by Caldwell or one of his men, the sheriff found tracks suggesting he was being pursued when it happened. Delilah closed her eyes, trying to process everything. Does this mean it's over? Not yet, Quentin replied, his voice hardening. Jameson sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Denver. They're sending someone to investigate, but it'll take time. And Blackwell's men were seen asking questions at the railroad station. They're still looking for something. For what? I'm not sure, Quentin admitted. But I think Frank might have taken something from Blackwell, something valuable enough that they'd track him across 3 states to get it back. A memory stirred in Delilah's mind. Before Frank left, he was acting strangely, secretive. I caught him digging in the root cellar one night. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was checking for rot in the supports. She shook her head. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but Quentin's eyes lit with understanding. He might have hidden something there. Together they hurried to the small exterior doors that led to the cellar beneath the house. The space was cool and dark, smelling of earth and the vegetables stored there. Quentin lit a lantern, casting long shadows as they began to search. It was Delilah who found a loose board in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of empty crates. When Quentin pried it up, they discovered a small hollow beneath, and in it, a leather satchel. With trembling hands, Delilah opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, deeds, maps, contracts, all bearing the name of Blackwell's front company. And beneath the papers, a small leather pouch that clinked when Quentin lifted it. "Gold coins," he said, weighing the pouch in his hand. Not enough to pay off his debt, but enough to get Blackwell's attention. Delilah examined the papers. These look like legal documents, property deeds, water rights. Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. These must be the original documents for the properties Blackwell has been acquiring. Without them, he can't prove ownership. That's why they've been hunting Frank so relentlessly, Quentin said, a note of admiration in his voice. He stole the evidence of Blackwell's empire. Without these papers, his claims to half the properties in Colorado and Wyoming are in question. And now we have them, Delilah said, a mixture of fear and determination in her voice. What do we do? Quentin's expression was grim but resolute. We take them to the federal marshal in Denver. These papers are evidence of fraud, possibly enough to finally bring Blackwell to justice. But Denver is days away, Delilah protested. And what about the children? I can't leave them, but I can't take them into danger either. We'll need help, Quentin agreed, people we can trust. The solution came in the form of Martha Jameson, the sheriff's wife, who agreed to stay with the children while Delilah and Quentin made the journey to Denver. The sheriff himself would check on them regularly, ensuring their safety in case Caldwell or his men returned. As they prepared for the journey, Delilah found herself torn between fear of the unknown and an unexpected excitement. She hadn't left Pine Creek in years, had never traveled without Frank or her parents before him. The idea of journeying to Denver, even under such dangerous circumstances, awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. The night before their departure, after the children were asleep and Mrs. Jameson had settled into the guest room, Delilah found Quentin on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, joining him at the railing. He turned to her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. "About going to Denver? Yes, it's our best chance to end this." "No," she said softly. "About me coming with you, I know I insisted, but if you think it would be safer for me to stay." "Safer, maybe," he acknowledged. "But these are your family's papers, your husband's legacy for better or worse. You have a right to see this through." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Besides, I've come to respect your judgment, Delilah Evans. I think I'd miss it if you weren't there to keep me honest." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "You're a good man, Quentin Drake, better than I deserve to find on my doorstep." "I don't know about that," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Delilah, made mistakes, hurt people. Haven't we all?" she replied. "What matters is what you choose to do now with the life you have left." Their eyes met and held in the silvery moonlight. Delilah was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean closer, might bridge the small distance between them. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should get some rest." "Long journey ahead." Delilah nodded, ignoring the pang of disappointment. "Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Delilah." As she turned to go inside, his voice stopped her. "Delilah," she looked back, questioning. "Whatever happens in Denver," he said quietly, "I want you to know that meeting you and your children, it changed something in me, something I thought was lost for good." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving her with a heart full of unspoken words and newfound hope. The journey to Denver was arduous but uneventful. They traveled by stagecoach, the precious satchel of documents kept close at all times. Delilah found herself enjoying the adventure despite the circumstances, the changing landscape, the bustling towns they passed through, the conversations with fellow travelers who had no idea of the dangerous cargo they carried. And she enjoyed the time with Quentin, away from the daily demands of the farm and children. In these unguarded moments, she learned more about his childhood on the Texas frontier, his time as a Union soldier during the war, his years as a marshal tracking outlaws across the territories. He spoke little of his personal life, however, and she sensed there were parts of his past he wasn't ready to share. A failed marriage, perhaps, or a lost love. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of admiration and something that might have been regret. Denver itself was a revelation, a sprawling city of brick buildings, paved streets, and more people than Delilah had seen in one place in her entire life. After the isolation of their small farm, the noise and bustle were overwhelming. Quentin secured rooms for them at a respectable hotel near the federal building, insisting on adjoining rooms with a connecting door for safety. The propriety of the arrangement wasn't lost on Delilah, who found herself both grateful for his concern and strangely disappointed by his scrupulous respect for her reputation. The following morning, they made their way to the office of U.S. Marshal Robert Hammond, a gruff, gray-haired man who greeted Quentin with the wary respect of old acquaintances. "Drake," Hammond said, gesturing them to seats in his cluttered office. "Been a while, heard you retired." "I did," Quentin confirmed. "This is a personal matter, Bob, Mrs. Delilah Evans." Her husband was Frank Evans. Recognition flashed in the marshal's eyes. "The man found dead up in Montana Territory, got the wire from Sheriff Jameson, said you might be coming." "Frank was involved with James Blackwell," Quentin explained, getting straight to the point. "Got in over his head, then tried to get out by stealing these." Delilah placed the satchel on the marshal's desk. Hammond's eyebrows rose as he examined the contents, whistling softly as he realized what he was looking at. "These are forged," he said, holding one deed up to the light. "Good forgeries, but I can see the alterations. Blackwell's been acquiring properties under false pretenses, then using these documents to legitimize his claims." "Exactly," Quentin agreed. "And he's been using his connection with bank managers like Webster in Pine Creek to foreclose on legitimate owners, then purchase the properties at a fraction of their worth." Hammond leafed through more of the papers, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is enough to charge him with fraud, possibly conspiracy, but Blackwell's slippery. He's got judges and politicians in his pocket across 3 territories. But not all of them," Quentin pointed out. "And with these documents as evidence, even his friends might think twice about protecting him." The marshal nodded slowly. "I'll need to keep these, get them to the district attorney." He looked at Delilah with unexpected kindness. "Mrs. Evans, your husband may have made some poor choices, but bringing these documents to light could help a lot of people who have been cheated by Blackwell." Delilah felt a complicated mix of emotions: pride in Frank's final act of defiance against Blackwell, sorrow for the price he'd paid, anger that he'd put their family in danger. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Hammond said, "we build a case. It'll take time, weeks, maybe months. And it won't be without risk. Blackwell will fight back when he realizes we have these." "What about Mrs. Evans and her children?" Quentin asked, concern evident in his voice. "They need protection." Hammond considered this. "I can send a deputy back with you to Montana, have him stay in town for a while, but my resources are limited, Drake, you know that." "I'll stay with them," Quentin said firmly, "until this is resolved." Delilah felt a rush of gratitude mixed with something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," she said softly. After providing sworn statements about Frank's involvement with Blackwell and how they'd discovered the documents, Delilah and Quentin prepared to return to Pine Creek. The marshal promised to keep them informed of developments and warned them to remain vigilant. "Blackwell's men will figure out soon enough that you've turned these over to us," Hammond cautioned. "Be careful." The return journey seemed to pass more quickly, perhaps because Delilah was eager to be reunited with her children, or perhaps because the burden of Frank's secret had been lifted. They spoke little during the long stagecoach ride, both lost in thoughts of what awaited them back in Pine Creek. It was evening when they finally arrived home, the farm bathed in the golden light of sunset. The children rushed out to greet them, followed more sedately by Martha Jameson. After assurances that all had been well in their absence, Martha returned to town, leaving the reunited family to settle back into their routine. That night, after the children were asleep, Delilah found Quentin in his customary place on the porch. He turned at her approach, and something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then held out a folded piece of paper. "Telegram came while we were gone. Sheriff Jameson held it for me." Delilah took it, unfolding it carefully. The message was brief. Drake stop Blackwell in custody. Denver stop charges. Include murder of Evans. Stop evidence sufficient for prosecution. Stop advise caution. Until trial concluded. Stop Hammond. Relief washed over her like a cool breeze. "It's over, just like that." "Not completely," Quentin cautioned. "There's still the trial, and Blackwell has allies who might cause trouble, but the immediate danger has passed. And Webster, the bank, with Blackwell's scheme exposed, I doubt Webster will be eager to foreclose on your farm. In fact, he'll probably be doing his best to avoid attention." A small smile touched Quentin's lips. "And your harvest looks to be excellent this year. You'll be able to pay what you legitimately owe." "Thanks to you," Delilah said softly. "We wouldn't have survived without you, Quentin." He shook his head. "You're stronger than you know, Delilah Evans. You would have found a way." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "So what happens now?" Delilah finally asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since Denver. Quentin turned to face her fully. "That depends. On what? On whether you still need 4 hands around here." Her heart quickened at his words. "The farm is doing well," she said carefully. "We could manage with just mine." "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice low. "To manage," Delilah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "No, that's not what I want at all." "What do you want, Delilah?" Quentin asked, taking a step closer. "I want you to stay," she whispered. "Not as a farmhand or a protector or a friend. I want you to stay as—" She faltered, suddenly unsure. Quentin reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "As what?" "As mine," she finished simply. "As ours, mine and the children's." His eyes darkened, and for a moment, Delilah feared she'd misread everything, had overstepped some boundary. But then his hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. "I've wanted to do this since the day I rode up to your farm," he murmured. Their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened, years of loneliness and newfound desire surging between them. Delilah's hands clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer as his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Delilah Evans. You and those 3 amazing children. I love the family you've made, and I want to be part of it if you'll have me." Tears of joy sprang to Delilah's eyes. "We would have you, Quentin Drake, with all our hearts." He kissed her again, more softly this time, a promise sealed beneath the vast Montana sky. The following spring, Delilah Evans became Delilah Drake in a simple ceremony at the small church in Pine Creek. Thomas stood proudly at Quentin's side, while Sarah and Mary scattered wildflower petals along the aisle. The whole town turned out to witness the union, Sheriff Jameson serving as best man and Martha as matron of honor. Webster, the banker, was notably absent. He'd left town shortly after Blackwell's arrest, his involvement in the land scheme having come to light. His replacement at the bank had been more than willing to refinance the Evans now Drake farm loan under favorable terms, especially once the bountiful harvest had been sold. As for Blackwell, news had recently arrived that he'd been convicted on multiple charges, including Frank's murder, and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His criminal empire had crumbled, the properties he'd fraudulently acquired returned to their rightful owners where possible. The wedding celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under lantern light in the town square. As the band struck up a waltz, Quentin led Delilah onto the makeshift dance floor. "Happy, Mrs. Drake?" he asked, his eyes tender as he held her close. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" "I rode into Pine Creek looking for a man who'd wronged me," Quentin said thoughtfully. "Instead, I found a family who healed me. I'd say that makes me the luckiest man in Montana territory." Over his shoulder, Delilah could see the children playing with their friends, their faces alight with joy. Thomas was growing tall and strong under Quentin's guidance, learning to be the man his birth father never was. Sarah had blossomed with the security of having a steadfast father figure, her natural shyness giving way to quiet confidence. And little Mary adored her new papa, following him everywhere and soaking up his stories and wisdom. Later that night, after they'd returned to the farm now expanded with a new bedroom added over the winter, and the children were asleep, Quentin and Delilah stood on the porch where so many of their important conversations had taken place. "I have something for you," Quentin said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with flowers and vines. "I've been working on it for months." Delilah opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of the children, their smiling faces captured perfectly. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "Turn it over," Quentin urged. On the back, engraved in flowing script, were the words that had changed their lives forever. "Then you'll have 4 hands now." "I don't understand," Quentin said with a teasing smile as he fastened the locket around her neck. "You started with 3 children and added me, that's only 1 more set of hands." Delilah took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, still flat but harboring their future. "Actually," she said softly, "it seems we're about to have 6 hands around here." Quentin's eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Delilah felt her heart might burst. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." "The start of our new chapter," Delilah agreed, wrapping her arms around his neck. As he carried her inside to their bedroom, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperation and abandonment to love and new beginnings. From 4 hands to 6, and perhaps more in the years to come. The life they were building together wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt or difficulty. But they would face them together, with 4 hands, 2 hearts, and the family that had found each other against all odds on a failing farm at the edge of the Montana frontier. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold across the valley, Delilah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel, a strong name for a child born of strength and perseverance. He had his father's storm blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was enveloped in a love born of second chances. On the day they brought him home from the doctor's house in town, Quentin gathered the family in the parlor, now warm and well furnished after a prosperous year. "I have something to say to all of you," he began, looking around at the faces of the children he'd come to love as his own. "Thomas, Sarah, Mary, when I first came to this farm, I told your mother that she would have 4 hands to help instead of just her 2. Now we have a new member of our family, and someday he'll add his hands to our work as well." Thomas, now 9 and growing taller by the day, nodded solemnly. "Family takes care of family, Pa, that's what you always say." Quentin's heart swelled at being called Pa. It still felt like a gift each time. "That's right, son, and that's why I want to make something official." He withdrew several folded papers from his vest pocket. "These are adoption papers. If you're willing, I'd like to legally become your father, not just in our hearts, but in the eyes of the law as well." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean we'd be Drakes too, like Mama and Danny?" "That's exactly what I mean," Quentin confirmed, "but only if that's what you want." "Yes." Mary exclaimed without hesitation, throwing her arms around Quentin's neck. At 6, she barely remembered her birth father and had accepted Quentin completely from the start. Sarah nodded shyly but with certainty, her hand reaching for Quentin's. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his young face serious beyond his years. "What about our real Pa?" he finally asked. "I know he did bad things, but—" Quentin knelt before the boy, placing his hands on Thomas's shoulders. "Your birth father will always be part of you, Thomas. Nothing can change that, and nothing should. The good and the bad, it's all part of your story. I'm not asking to replace him. I'm asking for the privilege of helping your mother raise you and for us all to be a family in every way possible." Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'd like to be a Drake," he said. "Like you." Delilah, watching from her rocking chair with baby Daniel nestled in her arms, felt tears of joy welling in her eyes. This man who had ridden into their lives when they were at their lowest had brought them not just survival, but a future filled with love and possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. As the years passed, the Drake farm flourished. The original homestead, grew to include more land, more animals, and eventually, 2 more children, twin girls who arrived 3 years after Daniel and completed their family circle. Thomas grew into a fine young man with his adoptive father's integrity and his mother's compassion. At 18, he chose to attend college in Denver, the first in their family to pursue higher education. Sarah developed a talent for teaching and eventually took a position at the Pine Creek School. Mary discovered a gift for healing and apprenticed with the town doctor, while Daniel showed his father's affinity for working the land. The twins, Elizabeth and Eleanor, were still young when Quentin and Delilah celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, a decade of partnership that had transformed not just their family but the entire community. The Drake farm had become known throughout the territory for its innovative farming methods and fair business practices, and Quentin's advice was sought by settlers and established ranchers alike. On the evening of their anniversary, after a celebration attended by most of Pine Creek, Quentin led Delilah to their special place, the porch where they'd shared so many meaningful moments. 10 years, Delilah marveled, leaning against the railing. At 40, she was still beautiful, though strands of silver now threaded through her dark hair and fine lines crinkled at the corners of her eyes when she smiled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you rode up to our door. Other times it seems like you've always been here. Quentin, his own hair now more silver than dark but his eyes still as vibrantly blue as ever, wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Best decision I ever made, stopping at your farm. Even though you were chasing Frank and found a woman with 3 children instead, she teased. Especially because of that, he replied seriously. I rode half my life looking for something I couldn't name. Turns out I was looking for you for this family we've built together. Delilah turned in his arms to face him. Do you ever regret it, taking on another man's responsibilities, raising his children? Not for a single moment, Quentin answered without hesitation. Thomas, Sarah, and Mary are as much mine as Daniel and the twins. Love doesn't recognize bloodlines, Delilah. It recognizes hearts that belong together. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines time had etched there. We've been blessed, haven't we, despite everything, or maybe because of it? We have, he agreed. And I plan to count those blessings every day for the rest of our lives. As the sun set over the prosperous farm they'd built together, Delilah thought back to that desperate day when a stranger had offered 4 hands instead of 2. She'd been left behind with 3 children, but what she'd found was so much more than help. She'd found a partner, a love, a future brighter than any she could have imagined. And it had all begun with those simple words that had changed everything. Then you'll have 4 hands now.